Welcome to the Nonprofit Report, your update on nonprofit organizations, issues, and leaders. I'm your host, Mark Oppenheim. Today, we're discussing some of the challenges of running a classical performing arts organization with Paul Helfrich, Executive Director of Orlando Philharmonic Orchestra, who previously ran the Dayton Performing Arts Alliance, which combined a ballet, opera, and symphony, and the West Virginia Symphony Orchestra, and also the Erie Philharmonic. So, Paul, this is going to be a great discussion because we get to cover an awful lot of ground with you.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it.
So, through the years, you've seen these classic arts organizations evolve from the earliest parts of your career to today, and the audiences have changed. The sensibility around classical music has changed, perhaps becoming a little bit more distant than it was in the past. How do you adjust to the changing tastes of the time, to the changing circumstances of the time? We've gone through COVID. It's been a real dance. It's been a real complicated journey that you've undertaken. And today, you face the same challenges of trying to get audiences in the door, get those butts in those seats, and also developing just this relationship, this interactive relationship with your audiences. How do you see that having evolved over the years?
Well, it's a real work in progress. Let's put it that way. I think every orchestra is struggling with the answers post-COVID because the answers are different in every community, and that's the thing. Let me give one good example. Many orchestras during the pandemic, and ours did to some extent as well, leaned into virtual programming. We got to put things online. We can put 5 musicians 6 feet apart in a room wearing masks. We could record something. So that's what we did. And then the question a lot of us faced is, well, do we continue to try to do that? And our answer here in Orlando has pretty much been no. And the reason is, I think that once you step into that platform and say we're going to put our content online, now you're competing with the Detroit Symphony and the Berlin Philharmonic and any number of ensembles who not only are really good, but have put a lot of time over the years into developing this very thing. A lot of us learned that, hey, it is not enough to just play in front of a camera. You've got to have, in addition to excellent sound editing, excellent video capability, including the wherewithal to put together a really polished program. And not all of us are there, and not all of us are in a position to make the investment. So what I think a lot of us do is we say, okay, well, how can we really demonstrate the value of having an orchestra in this community? Because this was something we asked a lot in Dayton, because the Cincinnati Symphony was an hour down the road, and there were lots of other good orchestras in Ohio. And I think the niche that a local orchestra has to fill is to do the things that you can only do if you're there 365 days a year. Education is a huge part of that. So our education program here in Orlando is a major part of what we do. We have musicians going out into the community, into schools, children's hospitals. We reach over 70,000 people with our young people's concerts, which this year we're able to return to in-person presentations. So we say when we do things like that, we're able to provide an experience that no visiting orchestra, no matter how good they might be, could provide. And we also allow our audience a chance to really connect personally with our artists, with our music director, with our musicians, of course, and maybe with guest artists that, if we feel they've established a particular rapport, that we bring back again. Those are some of the things that we do, but there are challenges without question. As I look at the field, there's some good news and there's some bad news. The good news is that the supply of musicians is better than ever. There is no lack of people honing their skills as an artist in conservatory and coming out ready to just step right into an orchestra. I mean, it's amazing. The depth of talent that you'll have, even in a smaller regional orchestra when you advertise a principal position. There's the good news. The good news, less good news, is that in every orchestra I've served, I can remember being there 4 or 5 years, and then inevitably somebody that I'd met who was just a really loyal supporter and came to everything. would pass away, and you'd have more and more of those. And sure, you would see new people coming, but it's rare that you see a new patron step up with that same level of fervor that we found in earlier generations. And I think it's just symptomatic of that loyal audience that would almost come no matter what, kind of fading. And we see that reflected all around the country in the subscription sales, because that was the traditional model, how orchestras got people in. Now that's kind of fading out a little bit. Then the other way that it affects fundraising is you see shifts in generational giving, where affluent families, maybe families fortunate enough to have set up a family foundation, the grandchildren have different priorities than their parents or their grandparents did. And so we're really having to make the case, some cases successfully, other cases less so, that the arts and the orchestra should remain the priority that they were. And another thing, and I will wrap up here just a moment, is that especially in the smaller cities, that the corporate changes. There used to be in a city like Dayton, to give you an example, many companies headquartered there that relocated, went to Charlotte or Atlanta or someplace like that. And so now you don't have the local decision makers, you don't have the local executive base that can really direct philanthropy. And another one that I've seen everywhere has been banking. I had a board president in West Virginia who said, 10 years ago, I could walk down the street and I could stop in each bank, and, the season would be sponsored by the time I got to the end of the block. And it's not that way anymore. I mean, now it feels like there's like 5 banks in the whole country, and so getting support at the local level in that particular industry is much harder than it used to be. I mean, there's usually some token amount, but it's not as generous as it was. And I think that reflects that ongoing trend towards consolidation and decentralized or more centralized control. So those are things we're contending with.
I think there's also the issue, if you look comparatively across the performing arts, and particularly music, there are certain forms that have crossed boundaries of ethnicity and race and tradition. If you look at the blues, for example, and then how that infected rock, and rock then infected hip hop, and hip hop infected, right, or jazz, right? Jazz has, it started off in African-American communities down in New Orleans. It spread throughout the country, and now jazz is an international musical form, right? But if you take a look at the 3 classic arts, symphony, opera, and ballet, they've been less successful in engaging across those boundaries. And so your audiences generally tend to be of European extraction. Your donors, your older donors, tend to be of European extraction, which means basically white. So how do you create an experience that is embraced by a much broader demographic, a much broader age, range of ages, and do the thing that the blues has done, which is, if you go to a blues festival, you see people of all ages, from the very young to the very old, right? You see people of all ethnicities, traditions. You see people of South Asian and East Asian extraction. You see people who are Black and white and Latin, Hispanic, and all these different folks coming together. Wouldn't it be great to see that audience mix, right, in all the different art forms?
Well, and you're absolutely right, and I think a lot of the issues that the classical arts, opera, ballet, and symphony have do relate to the way that we fund the arts in this country, because we rely so heavily on private philanthropy. They asked John Dillinger why he robbed banks. He said, well, that's where the money is. And so that's why orchestras and opera companies are so often associated with the very wealthy, because they have the money to fund them. So, I'm not going to say fortunately or unfortunately, it is what it is, but we have all kind of become associated with black tie galas and the support of the very affluent. And I think that is much more our problem than somehow a lack of appeal to any particular.
But it doesn't need to be that way. If you look
Yeah.
at the gaming community, for example, which is all young people, right? I mean, I can't press those buttons fast enough.
Yeah, yeah.
And you look at the phenomenal music that comes out of there, right? Classically informed music. If you look at film, right? And I don't care, whether it's a Fast and Furious movie or a John Wick movie or any of the other really sort of amazing things that are coming out of the film industry. What is the background music? It is very sophisticated stuff.
Oh,
Right?
for sure. And so that, that it really is my point, is that the music is not the problem. I mean, I think the music, can connect with anyone, anywhere, but we have put up certain, baggage around our field that may make people say, well, that isn't for me. I mean, I know this is a controversial idea, particularly here in Florida, but I do think there have been systemic inequities in our country. That is why, the main reason why there are fewer people of color who have generational wealth. And as I mentioned, it's the generational wealth that tends to be largely associated with the museums and the symphonies and the traditional arts. But the appeal of the music, is huge. And I always say, I just say, God bless John Williams, because, there are so many people in classical music who, the first thing they want to tell you is poo-poo it and say, oh, he stole this from so-and-so. He did. Look, what he's done is he has put millions of people in love with the sound of an orchestra and that unique sound, that only an orchestra can make, and that is something that we can build on for all sorts of music.
Yeah,
So
Arthur Fiedler with his Boston Pops before that, Leonard Bernstein with his education programs. But let's talk about your education programs, because that is a way where you can scale across a broad area. How do you view your education programs? Is it a way to create a more locked in, informed audience, so that they're actually equipped to understand your main stage performances? And is it a way to create a relationship at a very, very low cost of engagement? I mean, I see, for example, that you have these online virtual music lessons and some other offerings that it doesn't require me to do an annual subscription. I can, if I'm interested in picking up a particular instrument, I have that resource right here.
That's right. And I think I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was one of the best things that came out of the pandemic. That's when we started that. And afterwards, we realized, hey, this is something we really ought to keep, because there are barriers of, transportation and so forth that would be hard to overcome if we go back to all physical instruction. So we offer those both for traditional students as well as older musicians. We have people from age 7 to 77 participating in the virtual lessons, and that is something that has allowed us to reach out and maybe put aside some of those barriers of travel and costs that might otherwise be there. But I really think with education programs, what you're doing is, we kind of all have to do it because people are so mobile these days. I mean, maybe 60 years ago, I think people said, well, what we're doing is we're building an audience in this community. And now I'd probably say, well, you might be doing that, but a lot of these people who are in 3rd through 5th grade now will have moved on by the time they're adults. But I think overall, you're building people who have some knowledge, some appreciation of the classical arts, who can say, yeah, I heard an orchestra, I went to a concert. And so the nature of the experience that we provide is so important, because, I always say when we talk about, our programs for the young people's concerts and how various things are going over and whether we should include this or include that, I always just say the main thing I want, I mean, yes, it's great if kids leave and they know the difference between a clarinet and an oboe, but the main thing I want is them to say, I went to an orchestra and I had a great time. I went to an orchestra and it was fun and I loved the music and it made me feel happy I was there. And if we can do that I think is really important to set up that first experience. And sure, maybe some of them will play an instrument, maybe some of them will, develop an appreciation for it. Maybe it's something that they'll come back to later. But I think there's like a real long tail benefit. But ultimately, all of us in the arts believe strongly that this kind of activity, this kind of exposure, helps make people better people because it broadens their perspective on others, on history, on expression, in ways that that really only music can do.
Do you ever deconstruct a piece you mentioned John Williams and you mentioned some of the criticism and of course he's received so many awards as well and so much recognition.
Right, of course.
But do you ever take pieces and start to deconstruct how a composer might put those together or do comparative examinations so that your audience can get a sense of the composer's work in creating what they are hearing, or going back to some of the Lieder, which are the vocal works that basically take folk works and transcribe them into a different type of performance backed by a symphony orchestra, whereas they might have just been folk songs that were sung without accompaniment or with some sort of a lute-like instrument or a flute. How do you get people engaged in the structure of music so that they understand that part of the experience?
Yeah, well, I think that is, I think, a big part of the responsibility of the music director and a larger orchestra of a conducting staff, because those are so often the people who are in a position, whether they're speaking from the podium or doing something that's expressly a educational activity like a pre-concert talk or something like that, to find ways to do that are accessible and that are aware that there aren't that many people, even in an orchestra audience anymore, who may be aware of what a triad or a dominant seventh chord is and so forth. So to do it in a way that's elevating yet accessible. And, with the kids, I mentioned with the young people's concerts and keeping the experience fun, we always try to have the orchestra play something that we know that they're going to know. So, we always work in something that they can sing along. Up here in Orlando, no surprise, we tend to lean heavily into the Disney repertoire for that sort of thing. But I think the value of that, especially with kids, is they say, aha, I know that song, and the orchestra played it. So the orchestra plays music I like, not just music that, somebody got up and told me was from 200 years ago. So I think it's really important to make that connection.
But you can't get that experience in the New York Philharmonic. You cannot get that experience in the LA Philharmonic. You don't have that kind of a relationship. And that is also part of the experience, right? It's being part and parcel of this performance, right? You're not just sitting there passively.
Mm-hmm.
There's some interaction there.
Yeah, I think that's really important for kids, because see, that's one of the challenges that we have, is that the traditional orchestra experience is a passive listening experience, and we're in a culture that demands interaction and shareability and all these kind of things that people typically think of of an experience of being able to share it with their friends and interact with it in real time. And so the last thing we want to do with kids or younger people is to do that traditional. You come in, you sit quietly, you don't clap between movements, and at the end you show your appreciation. But instead have a format that kind of does connect with the way they experience things. I think another thing orchestras are going to wrestle with is the element of visuals, because the orchestra experience is also visually rather static. Of course, people who love it and have been around it forever, say, oh, I hang on every motion of the conductor and I I like to watch the way the concertmaster responds in certain situations and all those sorts of things. But most people are just looking, they say, well, there are people sitting in chairs. I went to a contemporary music concert, and there were some people were dancing and people were moving around. There was huge video screens. I could see, up close to the face of the performer. And so, we have to think there's more and more of an expectation that, at least in some situations, we'll be able to provide that sort of experience.
What kind of initiatives are you planning for the next couple of years? What are your priorities going forward?
Oh, well, that's great. I'm glad you mentioned that. One thing that we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out pops, because a lot of orchestras now that have had pop series, it used to be one of the most surefire things you could have. But now a lot of us are seeing, hey, what's going on here? Our pops audience is actually older than our classics audience, so we haven't replenished them, and that's because pops can mean so many different things. In Dayton, we were able to successfully take kind of a baby boomer classic rock audience and make that its own series. So that way we weren't having too many things on the pop series where, the older people are saying, oh, it's just too loud or something. So we were able to kind of lean more into, Great American Songbook and jazz, movie music, holidays, that sort of thing. So we do that in Orlando, but, it's kind of mixed results. So now we are really emphasizing the visual and trying to think of, at a pops concert, let's give people lots to look at. Let's have a magic performer. Let's have, the cirque. Let's have a film. And that seems to be going so far. So we've kind of made pops our laboratory for a lot of that. Another thing is that we are seeing that far more than putting out another statement about how inclusive you are, just show it on the stage. If you bring in diverse artists, you'll see diversity start to show in your audience, particularly when you bring in artists that are willing to do a lot of outreach and go out in the community and make connections directly at schools, universities, and so forth. So we're seeing a lot of good responses with that. With contemporary music, one thing that Eric Jacobson, our music director, has done really well is, I think, identify composers that are fresh and new, but whose music will connect well with our audience, and that's going to vary from community to community. But then have them do more than one thing, so people get to know them. And we're next year, for the third year in a row, we're going to play a piece by James Lee III, and we're really very fortunate to be working with him. But now that's a name that, rather than, oh, I don't know who that is, it's not Mozart. Now our audience knows who he is and has a certain element of trust established. And then another thing that I think Eric's been really good about is he's a great mentor. I mean, at only 4 years old, but he's already a great mentor to people coming up in the conducting profession. And we have really made a point to give women more opportunities and to, again, help our audience, our musicians, everyone become more accustomed, so that hopefully very soon we'll get to a point where that's no longer, wow, that's you don't see that all the time, but you get to the point where it's more every bit the norm. So those are some things we're doing.
You're making some really important points. These are business decisions, right?
Right.
You are creating educational programming to serve your audience, your clientele, and to get them engaged, right? You are scheduling people who will get different audience cohorts engaged, broadening your customer base, whether it's female conductors, or whether it is composers or conductors or artists of color, right? Whether it is taking familiar Disney tunes and playing them in the repertoire so that your children are engaged, or whether you're giving people visually stimulating experiences to create a higher degree of interest and diversify the audience to people who want music, but also different types of stimulation. What you're doing is you're creating an offering that is interesting. Oh my goodness, right? Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it's really interesting, because I say, a lot of times to people that are trying to, like, why do orchestras do, I said, you got to understand, if think of an orchestra as almost like a faith-based organization, because if you feel like you have like the true creed, you're not going to want to change it. I mean, you're going to be like, well, this is it, and we're going to do what we do, and we're going to tell people how great it is. But then, it's up to them to come. And what we try to do is, we say, look, the orchestra can play all sorts of music. We have the great core repertoire that really made the orchestra into the ensemble it is today. And we want to always have that at the center, but there's so many other things we can do, and there's so many other things we can do that can be meaningful in this community, just as you said. So that's kind of the overarching principle of all that.
And to me, what I find to be so fascinating is that if you look at the modern orchestra and its structure and its instruments and so on, and you start to go back in history, you see as you go back this change in the sensibility surrounding this art form from its earliest stages, where basically you just had people with instruments coming together to play folk tunes, right? And then over time, those instruments shifted and they became larger and larger. And for larger gatherings, you needed a certain formality. And so you had to have different sections, right? So now we have a string section. And then the technologies evolved. So you go from having the early types of percussive instruments down to the piano now, which is a highly technical and evolved instrument, right? What we have here now is going back to that connection in community, isn't it? Right? It's going back to getting people involved. And that's being criticized because it's no longer the formal thing, but it really doesn't need to be. Can't it just be fun for kids?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's an excellent point because, there are a lot of good things to that history, right? As music moved out of the salon and out of the chamber, it went onto a stage where like the public could come. What a concept. So the orchestra had to get bigger, it had to get louder, composers wanted to use new instruments. But then over time, once it became an institution, there started to develop a barrier, if you will, between the audience and what was happening on stage. And so, yes, now we're trying to kind of
deconstruct those barriers, right? Deconstruct the barriers. And that's really happening in local environments where that's so important. Smaller cities, right? It's not going to happen in the large cities in Chicago or LA or Pittsburgh or, the places with renowned orchestras that work fairly well, although they too have challenges. It's going to be in places that need to be more audience responsive, because if you're not audience responsive, you don't have a future, right?
That's right. That's absolutely right. Yeah. And we have to be very, thoughtful about how we go about it, because all of us, even if we're not the Chicago Symphony, we have business models that emulate that. Like most orchestras have a schedule, work rules, collective bargaining, all that set up to facilitate an orchestra that gives concerts in a downtown concert hall on Saturday night, with the idea being that people come and gather in a large space to hear it. Okay, so we're still going to do that, but we have to be able to get out of that and get out to other places and have smaller groups that, will fit in smaller places and that are affordable for community presenters, and all those sorts of things have to now be part of the mix as well as that core business.
Well, Paul Helfrich, Executive Director of Orlando Philharmonic Orchestra, thank you so much for allowing us to gain a little bit of insight into your world. Thanks for sharing the work of your musicians, of your funders, your audiences, your community, your volunteers. It is just so wonderful to have you here, and we very much appreciate it.
Thank you, Mark. It's been a pleasure.